Before we get into today's story, if you're new here, welcome to Velvet Confessions. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. We post new stories every week. And if you're already part of the family, thank you. You make this worth doing. Now, drop a comment below and tell me, where in Canada are you watching from? And we got people knowing whose hotel is out there listening. All right, let's get into it. Because this one stayed with me. The morning Cordelia Ashworth signed the divorce papers, she wore her good coat. Not because she wanted to look impressive. Not because she was trying to make a point. She wore it because it was November in Toronto, and the walk from the parking garage to her lawyer's office was 3 blocks, and she was done doing things that hurt her unnecessarily. That was, when you thought about it, the whole story in miniature. She was done doing things that hurt her unnecessarily. Cordelia Ashworth was 41 years old. She had dark circles she'd stopped trying to hide 2 years ago. She had a way of pausing before she answered questions, a habit her mother called thoughtful, and her ex-husband had called slow. She had hands that knew how to do things, how to rework a balance sheet at midnight, how to repair a ceramic glaze that had cracked wrong in the kiln, how to hold a stranger's gaze for exactly long enough. What she did not have anymore was a husband. What she did not have anymore was a reason to keep pretending she did. Her name had been Cordelia Marsh before the marriage. In the years since, she had quietly, steadily, almost invisibly become something her husband, Alistair, never thought to look for in his own home. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back. Alistair Pemberton was the kind of man who entered rooms like he'd already decided they weren't good enough for him. He was tall, well-dressed in the way that came from having other people choose his clothes, and possessed of the particular confidence that grows not from being right about things, but from never being seriously challenged on anything. He was 46 when Cordelia met him. She was 32. She had just taken a junior position at a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown Toronto, and he had been a client. The sort of client who brought lunch to meetings and left before the bill came. He had been charming. She had been, if she was honest with herself, lonely in the particular way that a very capable woman can be lonely, when the people around her keep asking her to be smaller. They married 18 months later, for the first 2 years. It was fine. Not wonderful. Cordelia had known wonderful, briefly, and this was not it. But fine. They had a house in Rosedale. They had a cleaner named Mrs. Petrov who came on Tuesdays. They had dinner parties where Alistair talked and listened, and their guests left, saying, "What a lovely couple. What a lovely couple." She heard that phrase so many times it stopped meaning anything, the way a word does when you repeat it too often. Lovely couple. Lovely couple. 2 people in proximity, dressed nicely, not visibly suffering. The suffering, when it came, was quiet. It started the way Alistair would interrupt her mid-sentence at dinners. Not rudely, never rudely. He was too careful for that, but with the smooth ease of someone who had simply decided her thought wasn't going anywhere interesting. The way he would answer questions directed at her when they were out with his colleagues. "What does Cordelia do?" someone would ask, and Alistair would say, "Oh, she's in consulting." The way you'd say, "Oh, she's fine," when someone asked after an elderly aunt. She was in consulting. She had in fact spent the last 4 years building something in consulting that had nothing to do with him. He didn't know. This was not because she had hidden it. Not at first. She had tried early on to talk about her work. He had listened with the expression of a man waiting for something relevant to begin. After a while, she stopped offering, and he stopped asking, and they both pretended this was normal. What Alistair Pemberton did not know about his wife, she had with her sister Rosalind and a former colleague named Declan, quietly a climate advice firm 3 years into their marriage. They had started with 2 clients. They had grown, carefully, the way things grow when no one is performing growth for an audience. They had grown because the work was rigorous and the timing was right, and Cordelia had an instinct for the patterns in data that other people missed. By the time she wore her good coat to the lawyer's office, the firm had 43 employees, contracts with institutional investors across 3 provinces, an evaluation that would have made Alistair's face do something interesting. she had never told him. Not because she was plotting anything, not because she was building toward a confrontation. She hadn't told him because he had never, not once in 9 years of marriage, asked her a question, and then waited for the answer. The thing that ended it was not dramatic. That is something the movies get wrong, Cordelia had thought later. They make it seem like there has to be a scene, a door slamming, a suitcase on a bed, something thrown. But most things end the way a candle goes out, not with the flame being blown, but with the wax finally running out. She had come home early from a trip to Calgary. A meeting had canceled. She'd caught a 4 o'clock flight and been back in Toronto by 7, which was unusual, and had let herself in quietly because Mrs. Petrov had a spare key. But not, she'd noticed, Alistair's Mercedes in the driveway, and she hadn't wanted to disturb anything. The woman in her kitchen was named Vanessa. Cordelia would later learn this, not from Alistair, who, when he arrived 20 minutes after, showed a remarkable ability to talk for a long time without actually saying anything. But from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it with the particular discomfort of someone relaying information they wished they didn't have. Vanessa was standing at the kitchen island. She was wearing one of the good robes, the Belgian linen ones from the guest bathroom, and she was eating leftover pasta from a container with a fork, the way someone does when they're at home. She was at home. Cordelia stood in the doorway for a moment. Vanessa looked up. There was a long pause of the kind that stretches out like DP. And then Cordelia said, quietly, "Could you give us a few minutes?" Not to Vanessa. She said it to the room. To the kitchen she had chosen the fixtures for. To the island she had picked out of a catalog on a Sunday afternoon while Alistair played golf. To the house she had kept running for 9 years while he kept running his mouth about it at dinner parties. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the wall. Nad. She did not cry. She had, she realized, been ready for this moment for longer than she'd consciously known. The grief wasn't sharp. It was more like finding confirmation of something you'd suspected for years, but kept hoping you were wrong about. A slow, heavy, particular kind of sad. When Alistair arrived and knocked on the bedroom door, his voice already arranged into its defensive shape, she told him, clearly and without drama, that she was done. He said a number of things after that. He said he was sorry. He said Vanessa meant nothing. He said he didn't know how it had happened. He said Cordelia had always been so closed off, always so in her head, always so. And here, he searched for a word. Separate. She listened to all of it, and when he finished, she said, "I know. I think we've both known for a while." There was nothing he could say to that, because she was right. The divorce took 8 months. Alistair had expected, Cordelia understood, that the process would give him leverage. That she would want the house, want the lifestyle, want some portion of the considerable assets he had accumulated in his name. He had expected a negotiation. What he had not expected was a woman who didn't want anything he had. She took her personal belongings. She took her car. She took the ceramic pieces she'd made over the years and a framed photograph of her mother. She moved into a rental in the annex which she had chosen because it had good light and was walkable to a coffee shop she liked. The firm, which was in her name, and Rosalind's, and Declan's, was never discussed because he didn't know it existed. His lawyer asked about any business interests in the discovery process. Her lawyer confirmed there were none in the marital estate. This was, technically, precisely correct. Cordelia did not volunteer information Alistair had never thought to ask for. She signed the papers. She wore her good coat. She walked the 3 blocks back to the parking garage, and she sat in her car for a while, not crying, just breathing, watching the November light flatten out across the concrete. She felt, more than anything, like someone who had put down a very heavy bag. She did not think about him much after that. This surprised people. Her sister Rosalind, her friend Maureen, various women she knew who had been through their own divorces and wanted to compare notes. They expect, or grief, or a period of reconstruction. They brought wine and advice and told her she would find someone better. Cordelia thanked them and changed the subject. The truth was that she had a company to run. She had 43 employees whose livelihoods depended on decisions she made. She had a Series B funding round to close, a conference in Vancouver to present at, and a junior analyst named Tobias, who had real promise if someone would take the time to develop it. She did not have, anymore, a man to arrange her life around. She had not understood, until he was gone, how much of her interior space he had been occupying. Not with his presence, but with her management of his absence, the constant low-level effort of existing carefully in a house where she was not fully seen. Without that, she had a startling amount of room. She used it. The year after the divorce, the firm grew by 30%. They won a contract with a major pension fund. Cordelia was invited to speak at a conference in Halifax, and she accepted, even though public speaking had always made her nervous, because she had decided that nervous was no longer a sufficient reason not to do things. She was not, she told Rosalind, thriving in the inspirational quote sense. She was just working. She was just living. She was just doing, finally, the things she had been doing all along, but in a house with good light, and no one to interrupt her. She might have continued life indefinitely, quietly, capably, without narrative, if it had not been for the conference in Ottawa. It was a national summit on sustainable finance. Cordelia had been asked to present on climate risk modeling, which was the firm's specialty, and she had prepared carefully and arrived the night before and had coffee at the hotel bar because the restaurant was full. Alistair was there. She saw him before he saw her. He was across the lobby, talking to two men in suits, and he looked. She noticed this with the calm of a scientist noting data. He looked tired, thinner, less certain of the room than he usually was. He saw her. There was a moment. Then he excused himself and walked over, and she stood and waited because there was nothing else to do. Cordelia, he said. Alistair. He asked how she was. She said well. He looked at her name on the conference lanyard. Cordelia Ashworth, Marchfield Climate Advisory, CEO. And something moved across his face that she could not entirely identify. It was not quite recognition. It was something more complicated than that. You're presenting tomorrow? He said. I am. I didn't know you. He stopped. Started again. I didn't know. The firm had gotten so large. She looked at him evenly. You didn't ask. It came out gentler than she'd intended. There was no anger in it. She had used up whatever anger there might have been in the fur after the marriage, running quietly through the into her work until it converted into something more useful. What was left was just a fact, stated plainly. You didn't ask. He absorbed this. His jaw worked slightly. He was, she realized, a man who had spent years being told things were fine and had believed it because it was easier than paying attention, and he was only now beginning to understand what that had cost him. I heard the firm was doing well, he said finally. It is. Congratulations. A pause. I mean that. She studied him for a moment, the tired eyes, the careful posture of a man who had lost something and was still locating the shape of it. She felt unexpectedly something close to compassion, not for what he'd done, for what he was only now figuring out he'd missed. Thank you, Alistair, she said. And then, because she was someone who finished sentences, take care of yourself. She picked up her coffee, and she walked back across the lobby, and she found a chair near the window, and she sat in it and looked out at the Ottawa. Night, the Parliament buildings, lit up against the dark, the river just visible beyond. She did not feel victorious. She did not feel sad. She felt mostly like herself, which was, she had come to understand the whole point. Her presentation the next morning went well. She had not expected it to go this well. She had prepared for competent. What happened was something closer to, she wasn't sure. A room of 200 people in finance and policy who had come in expecting a technical session and had found themselves, somehow, moved. Not by the data, though the data was sound, but by the way she talked about it, the way she connected numbers to consequences, the way she paused at exactly the right moments and let the weight of things land. Afterward, a woman named Philippa from a pension fund in Vancouver asked if they could talk. A man named Edmund, who ran a family office in Calgary, asked for her card. 3 people from the Federal Civil Service took notes. She sat in the hotel restaurant that evening with Rosalind, who had split a bottle and they split a bottle of Niagara Riesling and talked about nothing important for 2 hours, and it was one of the best evenings Cordelia could remember. You were extraordinary today, Rosalind said somewhere in the second glass. Cordelia considered this. I was just myself, she said. I know, said Rosalind. That's what I meant, she learned some months later. Not from him, from the specific grapevine that connects Toronto's financial and social circles in ways that feel inevitable. That Alistair had tried to look into her firm, had asked around, had understood gradually through conversations with people who knew people what had been building in his house while he was elsewhere looking for things he thought he was missing. She heard that he had called once. Her assistant had logged it professionally and asked if she wanted to return it. She thought about it for 3 days, then she called back. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting. I wasn't sure you would, he said. I almost didn't. A long pause. I found out, he said carefully, some things I should have known a long time ago. Yes, about the company. About what you built while we were. He stopped. While we were married, she said, not unkindly. Why didn't you tell me? She thought about this. The honest answer was layered. There was the answer about him not asking, and beneath that, the answer about her. Not wanting to offer things to someone who had made it clear they wouldn't be received, and beneath that something older and harder about a woman who had learned, across years, that the safest thing to do with what was valuable in her was to keep it somewhere he couldn't mishandle it. But she had decided in the year since the conference that she was done with answers that cost her something to say. Because you never made me feel like it was safe to, she said. Another pause. Longer this time. I know, he said. I know that. It was the first time in all the years she had known him that she had heard him say that sentence without a qualifier attached. No, I know, but. No, I know, however. Just, I know that. What do you want, Alistair? I'm not sure, he said honestly. I think I called because I didn't want it to end with you thinking I never understood. She sat with this for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay, I hear you. She looked out the window. Good light, always good light in this apartment, the light she had chosen for herself. I don't think there's anything left to rebuild, but I'm glad you understand now. I am. The conversation ended quietly, the way things end when all the sharp edges have finally been worn smooth, not with resolution, exactly. More with honesty. More with the particular piece of two people who have stopped pretending they are something they are not to each other. She put the phone down. She made tea. She sat in the good light and looked at the ceramic pieces arranged on her shelf. The ones she had made, over the years of the marriage, the ones she had taken when she left, and thought about how long she had been making things he never noticed. The things were beautiful. They had always been beautiful. It had simply taken her a while to find a house where they could be seen. Tobias, her junior analyst, had his first big client presentation 3 weeks after that. He came to her office beforehand, visibly anxious, holding his notes too tightly. What if they push back on the methodology, he said. Cordelia looked at him. She thought about a version of herself 9 years ago, holding something too tightly, afraid of what would happen if she let it be seen. Then you walk them through it, she said, slowly, without apologizing for knowing what you know. He nodded, took a breath, went to his presentation. He did well. She heard from Rosalind later that day that the Pshin Fund in Vancouver, Philippa's fund from the Ottawa conference, had signed a letter of intent. 43 employees became 47. The Series B closed 2 weeks after that. She called her mother that evening. Her mother was 73 and lived in a house outside of Kingston, and she had, in Cordelia's memory, never once told her to be smaller. Never once suggested that capable was something to hide. How are you, sweetheart? Her mother asked. Good, said Cordelia. And then because it was true and she had decided to say true things. Really good, actually. I can hear it, her mother said. You sound like yourself. Cordelia stood at her kitchen window, her own kitchen, her own choice, and looked out at the city in the early dark, the lights coming on across the Toronto skyline, something she had looked at her whole life, without ever quite getting tired of it. I am, she said. Finally, outside November had turned to March, the snow was going. There was that particular quality of late winter light that promises something without quite delivering it. Yet, the way the air feels just before things start again. She stayed at the window a little longer than she needed to. She was in no hurry. She had at last nowhere else to be.